David van Veek is Chief Researcher at Benchmark Foundation. Thank you very much, David, for your time this afternoon. How much has so-called development cost many communities and families around South Africa?
Well, I think first and foremost we must understand that mining does not really constitute development because it's not sustainable and it's not renewable. Minerals get finished and a big mess get left behind. People's graves are their title deeds to their land in Africa. They don't have the formal documents and things like that, but the graves of their ancestors is what makes their claim to that land. If we look at land restitution in South Africa, very often communities who were able to point to the graves of their ancestors were the ones who succeeded in their land claims. But what we have found since 1960 to 1983, 3.5 million black South Africans were forcibly removed from their land for purposes of economic development, purportedly by the apartheid regime. And that hasn't stopped in 1994. It just continues going on and on and on. We had Seriti having a fight with a local community in August 2022. We had Anglo having a fight with the Sporong community in Bleskop in February 2023. We are having the Machete community in Limpopo, who's had a fight with the Beers for many, many, many years, having been removed from their ancestral lands and so on. So I'm not surprised by what is happening in Mafube, and I feel very sad for those people and for what is happening to them, because a coal mine is an open cast mine, and most certainly those graves are going to be desecrated. And when mining companies say, oh no, it's okay, we will compensate people and so on, they don't understand the link between people, their land and their graves and their identity. And this is because mining companies use archaeologists and funeral people, undertakers, when these removals take place. And archaeologists don't have a clue. They need to use anthropologists and sociologists, people who understand the community and where the community comes from and how that land is linked to that particular community. There's no compensation that you can pay people for having lost their ancestral land. And very often the land onto which people are relocated is the cheapest land that the mining companies can get their hands on, and very often that land is not economically viable for self-sustaining agriculture or any other economic activity for that matter. And very often the compensation paid for graves, 15,000, 20,000 and so on, is not nearly enough in terms of the impact it has on the identity of those people. In South Africa, we continue to behave as if we are living in the era of Cecil John Rhodes, where mining corporations just basically run roughshod over the indigenous people of this country. It's absolutely shocking what is taking place.
Mm. You sort of anticipated my next question, more so when you speak of rather getting in anthropologists instead of archaeologists. Are there feasibility studies that are conducted? You also mentioned the issue of the previous regime and the current regime and nothing much really changing. In terms of the feasibility studies, we'll revisit that. Are the communities engaged in terms of what is going to happen? How will it impact you? And can we get your permission?
Well, you see, what is happening at the moment is that there's consultation between mining companies and communities. But the word consultation is wrong, because you should use the word negotiation. The wording of the Minerals Petroleum Resource Development Act says consultation. And what happens is then when people sign an attendance register for such a consultation, the DMRE and the mining company takes that as consent, when very often people are not consenting, they're not agreeing, and there's no formal agreement between them and the mining company. The mining company uses subcontractors to do the feasibility studies, the environmental impact assessments, the social impact assessments, and so on. And when the community turns around to the mine and say, but this is not what you promised, the mine says, it's not us who promised, it's the consultant who promised. Sorry, we can't help you.
You spoke about a lack of change from the previous regime to the current regime in terms of keeping up the status quo. Are you then suggesting that some South Africans are left to their own devices?
Well, I think that poor rural communities don't have access to the law. The law is very expensive in this country. Mining companies have an awful lot of money and very fancy lawyers and academics and so on that they can turn to. The situation around the table when there is this consultation is not a balanced situation. People don't understand what the mining company is saying, what it's offering, what it's not offering. The mining companies never ever in their consultation talk about the negative impacts of the so-called mining development that will be there on communities and so on. And the thing is that our government is obsessed that mining is the only avenue towards development. It ignores agriculture, it ignores tourism, it ignores all the other avenues that are open to communities. And communities are never offered the technical expertise to say what alternatives are there to mining. Are we being offered because the opportunity cost of mining is immense on communities, whereas the benefits from mining is actually very few.
You would have heard from that package by our colleague Zikhona Chona, an elderly woman speaking about wanting ukuphatla or visiting the graves where your ancestors are and not finding them. When we speak about perhaps understanding, because it suggests that land is connected to spirit, right? There is a very intimate relationship between land and spirit and spirituality. And so there, I don't even know how to pose this question, because what then are the consequences?
Well, I think the consequences in our country is that we've got a society which is rudderless, that has that lacks identity, because the connection between the land and ancestors and the community has been broken. And we forced upon people this European model of development, which doesn't have any African context. If we look at China, if we look at Japan, if we look at the Asian countries, their development is exactly successful because they respect their own spirituality, their own identity, and they have molded the system to suit their identity, their culture, and so on. Whereas in South Africa, multinational corporations just come here and they run roughshod over people. They don't care, because somehow African lives are not equal to the lives of people in other continents.
David van Wyk, Chief Researcher at Benchmark Foundation, thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon.